So far, we've been seeing very simple input and output for our basic programming examples. We've also not seen actually what triggers certain code to begin running, and we might have the basics of the programming down, but maybe not the specifics of what causes the code to run and more advanced ways of getting input and showing output on our user interface. So let's begin with events. Events can happen when users or the program in some way manipulates an element on the interface or in code. For example, the page might load, the user clicks or taps a button, the window is resized, a form gets input from the user, the mouse moves over something. These are all events that could make code run. First, the user interacts with the program by perhaps clicking a button. At that point, an event occurs. When an event occurs, it's described as having been fired or been raised. Events can then trigger a function or certain code. At this point, code within the function will run. Something on the screen then is maybe updated or modified in some way as a result. How your code reacts to the events are called event handling. The event occurs, this triggers code to run, the code handles the event. Events can go hand in hand with user interface and elements that belong to the program, such as when a new page or interface shows up, when the user does something, or when an element in the program interacts on the interface. The user interface is what the user sees on the screen of their device. It lies between the code that we write and what the user eventually sees. How the program itself and the user interact with the interface is what causes the code to run, or the events to fire. We then can handle these events and make sure the proper code is run when the program is being interacted with. The ways this is all coded and created, from setting up the user interface to setting up how the events will trigger the code and how we handle the event, is very different depending on the programming language. I will go over briefly 2 different languages to give you an idea of how this might work. This is going beyond the basics of non-language specific programming concepts, but I feel like it's important to see how this might work in a very visual interface build like Swift and a more scripting type of language interface build like JavaScript. Swift is Apple's new programming language. It uses its own dedicated editor called Xcode for coding and building the user interface. The elements for the interface can be added simply by dragging them from an object library to the storyboard canvas or the screen that the user sees. Buttons, labels, input boxes, etc. You can position them, size them, and give properties to them. Once the elements are on the screen, then you can open the code window and connect them to the code by dragging the different elements between the interface and the code screen and setting up outlets to connect them. If you want an action or an event to take place with that element, you create an action that will reference a piece of code that will execute when the user or action fires or takes place. For example, a button you place on the interface can have an action added that when it is clicked, the code and the function associated with that button would run. Different parts of the user interface, such as the text input boxes, are used in code to receive input from the user and other objects, like the label we are using here to output text to the user. JavaScript uses any simple text editor for coding and building the user interface. JavaScript works with 2 other types of files in web-based application programming to get the interface, events, and user interaction and how it's presented to work together. For the structure of the elements of the interface, HTML or hypertext markup language is used for how these elements look, CSS or cascading style sheets are used, and to handle events, either CSS or JavaScript is used. The DOM, or Document Object Model, which is all the elements that are a part of any program written using HTML, is used to target specific parts of the interface to add event handling. For example, JavaScript could be coded to listen for an event to fire, and then that event, such as a click, when it fires, it triggers a certain function to be called and the function's code to run, which handles the event. Different parts of the DOM are used to get user input and to give output to the user. So we see that different languages will handle events and how the interface is built differently, but events fire in any language and the code that runs to handle the events all has the same programming basics that we have learned in these past lessons.